Welcome to Connect Caribe Report here on Kalaloo Alliance Media, our TV network. Today we bring you an exclusive special report on a game-changing development for the Caribbean, the St. Croix Megaport Vision, a St. Croix Economic Development Initiative. As the global trade landscape evolves, massive projects like China's Chanque Megaport in Peru under the Belt and Road Initiative are making waves in the international shipping and commerce. However, questions are being raised about the Caribbean's role and whether we are positioned to benefit or left to compete with such monumental undertakings. In this episode, we shift our focus to the bold vision for St. Croix, a transformative project that has the potential to redefine regional trade, logistics, and connectivity for the Caribbean. Can the centralized geographical strategic positioning of St. Croix in the region consequently make St. Croix South Shore Free Trade Zone an ideal location for the creation of a new maritime industry? Our co-host, Ambassador Thomas, Chairman and CEO of the Pleon Group, John Clendenin of the ICY Group, as Principal Publisher of Financial IT, will explore what this megaport means for the Virgin Islands and the region at large. Can the St. Croix megaport position the Caribbean as a stronger player in the global trade? What opportunities does this bring for regional transformation and economic growth? Stay tuned as we dive deep into the possibilities, challenges, and the broader implications for the region. I'm Jennifer Hyland, your co-host here on Connect Caribbean Report, where we're bridging the islands, uniting communities, and unlocking new possibilities for the entire region. Stay tuned as we dive into the stories and innovations that are shaping the Caribbean's region. This is your front row seat to the next wave of regional transformation we're covering here on Connect Caribbean Report. And we'll be right back with Ambassador Thomas and John Clendenin in Connect Caribbean World right after these messages.
For thousands of years, humans have searched for better and faster ways to trade with one another across the globe as a way to improve our world. And in that time, the principles of commerce have remained the same: to finance transactions, to mitigate risk, and to connect buyers and sellers. But what has changed is that the world has gotten smaller. Barriers to entry are declining, and technology is bringing the world forward into a new economy. Throughout it all, Exim remains a constant partner. We're here to guide and support you through this new frontier of trade, empowering U.S. businesses to export safely and confidently. In fulfilling our mission, we'll help you navigate and overcome new challenges successfully. Together, we'll help make this world better, whatever the future holds. No matter where we go or how we get there, Exim will be along for the ride.
This is a Bloomberg Money Minute. We'll soon be hearing from NVIDIA that is reporting its latest earnings. Investors want to know if the world's most valuable company can continue its remarkable run that's been fueled by demand for its artificial intelligence products. A Barclays strategist says NVIDIA's profit report may be the most anticipated event on Wall Street for the rest of the year, beating out the upcoming jobs report and even the next meeting of the Fed on interest rates. The company that makes Tom's of Maine toothpaste has been put on notice. Inspectors with the FDA say water used to make Tom's Simple White Clean Mint toothpaste, sold by Colgate-Palmolive, contain dangerous bacteria that can cause blood and lung infections. And inspectors say the company ignored multiple instances of contamination, including 400 complaints about odor, color, and taste. Tom says its products are safe and it's working with the FDA to fix the problems. I'm Nancy Lyons, Bloomberg Radio.
Hello and welcome to Connect Caribe World. And I am really excited that I have with me my co-host. I get to interview you, John.
Thank you, Dr.
Great to
Thomas.
have you in my segment. Okay. Now, John, today we are really talking about a major game-changing initiative, and that is the concept of megaports. Recently in the news, it's been highlighted that our hemisphere will now have a very large megaport based in Peru. As a supply chain expert, could you describe the significance of megaports? And then I'll ask you my next question, which deals with whether the Caribbean can have one. But first of all, explain to us the significance of megaports and what they bring, and are they relevant?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thomas. I think the salient thing to consider is that in the world of trade facilitation and how countries and regions interact with each other, major trading blocs. So whether you're talking about the European Union, ASEAN and Asia, when you're talking about other kinds of associations like the BRIC nations, which is Brazil and Russia and India and China, the movement of those goods and the political implications of those are significant. And particularly when we look at the United States and the recent elections and what those policies might be or change. And later on in the show, we'll talk about, as you know, the prior State Department under President Trump's vision for the area. The concept of how do these mega ships that are being developed with containers actually be able to negotiate in what's becoming mega ports. So when you talk about, as you introduced in China, if I look at the region from the perspective of trade and what those economies represent, there's a mega port that we should consider that's in Peru, north of Cusco and Lima, that the Chinese have just built and opened in November. But there's also a mega port in Cartagena in Colombia, and also in Santos in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And those are the major mega ports right now that control the movement of goods. So the interesting thing, when we then contrast, which we'll look at later when we connect the dots, about what are the ports now in the CARICOM nations, and then include the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, those little ports, which have smaller capacities and smaller ships, are dwarfed by how does the major cargo enter the area, and how do we think about that? So back to the Chinese port. The interesting things to think about are that, one, this is a large port that's been developed in Peru. It's on the Atlantic. So in order for it to affect the Caribbean, it's going to take advantage of the new enhanced Panama Canal. So then smaller ships can come into the region, but the larger ships from China can come there. It's interesting that this is a private port. The land is actually owned by the Chinese, which has other implications. So Chinese president went and opened the port in November with the Prime Minister of Peru. And this is some 2,500 acres. It also has about a 1.8 kilometer tunnel that actually goes to the warehousing. So there's some infrastructure issues, but the implication becomes, what if China were to use this as a military port? What are those implications? What are the implications on cybersecurity? Who inspects the cargo that comes in and out of those ports? So when we look at those thousands of tons of containers that come into the port and then come into the Caribbean region through the Panama Canal, what are those processes in place? So the countries that are connected is how many countries connect to the port. So if you look at some 800 different countries that come in through the port in Cartagena, and in Santos, 600 different ports it's connected to. We look in the Caribbean, and our ports are only connected to a few other countries in the Caribbean, and then maybe a trading partner. So that's the overall perspective of saying, as we look to say, how do we connect the Caribbean, as we did with the MOU that we talked about with Governor Bryant and the private sector, how does the private sector take these mega ports and say, do we as individual countries, can we interact with those mega ports? And the answer is probably no. And so therefore, how do we engage in megaports? And that is by consolidating the shipments within the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. That really gives me and our audience a really great frame. Thank you for that. Going to ask you one more question. Now, I write books, and that's one of the things I do. And I define now vision as a greater future that is trapped in today. So I define that vision is not a fantasy. Vision is trapped in the ingredients of today. So, using that as my concept, does St. Croix, the port in St. Croix, does it have the ingredients to become a megaport?
Okay, so the simple answer to the question is yes and no. so, the point is that does it have the capability? Okay, and the answer is absolutely yes. The thousands of acres on the south shore of St. Croix are integrated with one of the largest refineries that was in the Western Hemisphere that is in the process of reopening. There's the former Renaissance Park, which was the home of Martin Marietta in the day with aluminum factories, and that Renaissance Park has a turning basin and a deep port. The port run by Ocean Terminals in St. Croix is an existing deep water port that takes the tankers and fuel, but there's also molasses port and some smaller ports within St. Croix. The whole industrial area that was designated as a free trade zone is alive and well on the south shore of St. Croix. So that is the capability and the vision, if you will, of how it can become a megaport. Of course, we have to do something in order to make those things happen. So just the other fundamental things are, what kind of investments are we willing to make? What kind of legislation? How do we think about the notion of a megaport in the Caribbean and its constituents lead with multiple currencies in the Caribbean? We have people with visas that cannot come in and out of the United States, and or St. Croix is part of the version protection customs zone. And so with some legislation, we can then have people travel freely, the people among the Caribbean, almost like the Schengen visas and the CARICOM visas. And we can have goods and cargo go with legislation that's empowered in the Virgin Islands legislature to control customs. So the finances, the free movement are all things that have the capability to interact precisely with your vision. Now the question is, how do we implement that? And the MOU that was signed with Governor Albert Bryant Jr. and the private sector is the first step in that regard.
Thank you so much. So, essence, what you're saying, the ingredients are there, but there's one ingredient that's going to define it: our commitment to make it happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And with that, I hand over to our host, Jennifer Highland. Your sound is off.
Thank you very much, John Clendenin and Ambassador Thomas, for setting the framework and the tone for the discussions coming up in the other segments. We really need to do a deep dive and learn more about the potential of the St. Croix and Megaport vision. So we'll be right back after these messages in a few minutes.
With the Bloomberg Small Business Report, I'm Tracy Jonke, brought to you by Dell.com. Shop Small is a Small Business Saturday rallying cry that younger adults in particular seem to take to heart. A Bankrate survey about Thanksgiving weekend shopping plans finds half of U.S. adults intend to check out the small business deals on the Saturday after the holiday. Broken down by age group, it looks like small shopkeepers will see more millennials and Gen Z shoppers in their stores. Baby boomers and Gen Xers are less likely than average to shop Small Business Saturday. And we can't say it's because they got their holiday shopping out of the way early. Bankrate says the youngest adults were the most likely to shop the October sales. Across generations, larger retailers are seen as having a price advantage, but the survey found that when it comes to customer service and the uniqueness of the merchandise, shoppers believe small businesses have the upper hand. And that's the Bloomberg Small Business Report. With the Bloomberg Small Business Report.
Welcome, everyone, to Connect the Dots. And I'm here with my co-host, Chris Principe. And what I hope to do in this segment is, together with Chris, to look at what are we doing to connect the dots of these megaports, and particularly the dots within the Caribbean. So we talked in the first segment about the megaports in Peru, in Cartagena, and in Brazil. And now I want, and those with like the 2,500 acres of ports and the 800 kinds of other ports that they're connected to. So if we connect the dots in the Caribbean, let me just go over some of the, the salient parts of what are ports in the Caribbean right now that we are hoping to bring together in a megaport in St. Croix. So for example, we have Antigua and Barbuda and the port of St. John. The Bahamas has Freeport's container port. There's Bridgetown has Barbados's port, and Belize has Belize City. We have Dominica with the port of Roseau. Grenada has the port of St. George's. Guyana, the port of Georgetown with 30 acres. Port-au-Prince with 20 acres. We have Jamaica with 40 acres in Kingston. Montserrat at the port of Plymouth with 5 acres. So these are very small ports. If you come into Puerto Rico, now you're in the area of thousands of acres in Puerto Rico and San Juan with their port infrastructure. And in the Virgin Islands, when we look at the 3 islands of St. John, which has a port, the port in St. Thomas, and then in St. Croix with the Renaissance Park area that we talked about and the South Shore, we have thousands of acres that could be committed to the port, called demurrage charges by being offshore. There's the area of cross-docking and warehousing and inspection. So all of these containers that have to go to the U.S., less than 3% of containers are inspected right now. So the whole notion of St. Croix not only becoming a megaport, but becoming a superport kind of status, where the cargo that's coming to U.S. ports, because of the Jones Act, we can have foreign flag ships stop here and then go to the U.S. We can improve the security. The other aspect I would mention is in the currency. So we have some 13 different Eastern Caribbean dollars And I'm going to turn this over to Chris Principe, the Guyanese dollar, Haitian Gordel, Jamaica dollars, Netherlands Antilles guilders, Surinamese dollars, Trinidad and Tobago dollars, TT dollars they call them. And we look at the Bahamian dollar, Barbadian dollar, Belize dollar, Bermudian dollar, Cayman Islands dollar, all of these different currencies, and then languages. We've got Spanish and we got French and we've got Dutch. All of these things have to be connected. And that's what we're doing here in Connecting the Dots, is thinking about those things together with Chris. So Chris, how do we connect these dots in the financial world?
Well, John, thank you. First, it was very interesting, your interview with the ambassador, and you made some really excellent points about what a megaport is, and then also about what it means in St. Croix. And I bring that up because the tendency, I think, is to start comparing what they're doing in Peru to what we can do in St. Croix. And you can't compare ports. Ports are defined by their geographic location, by the physical geography. Is it deep water or not? It's defined by the economy that surrounds it, the infrastructure that surrounds it. All these things make each megaport unique and built with different goals in mind. Now, I agree fully with your assessment that the ingredients are all here, because they truly, truly are. So what we have to look at is how do we take this unique location, this unique infrastructure, and be able to develop it in a way that takes advantage of both our Caribbean neighbors as well as the U.S. and the unique status that is been afforded to the Virgin Islands that really hasn't been used or leveraged. So I think that first part there, and as the ambassador said, the commitment to do it is the key thing. Now, yes, we have on the financial side, there's certainly a bit of confusion that has to be sorted out, because if you constantly are changing multiple currencies, it just adds to the cost and to the time in doing the transactions. So and it becomes a part of national pride. We want our own currency. It's similar to what happened in the EU in the beginning of the EU, where all the countries went to the euro except for the UK, and of course now UK is just pulled out totally. But here we have the same issue. There is a big measure of national pride in each one's currency. So how do you do it? And there might be some different approaches there. A central bank for the Caribbean, maybe using a crypto, a digital currency that everyone is attached to. So, John, the challenges are there, but the commitment to do it is what we need.
Right. So, Chris, let's do a deep dive in these connecting the dots, because I know this is an area that some of our listeners may not be totally familiar with. I'm going to add another element here called inflation. Okay. So when we take these currencies, one is that, do the governments allow their dollars, like in Trinidad, TT dollars, how many dollars can be exported, and how do they have access? Let's say if they're going to do the transaction in US dollars, how many millions of US dollars can a small business or the government actually leave? If we go back years ago in the beginnings of my world with Xerox Corporation in the 80s, we had Brazilian cruzeiros, and then we went to cruzados, and then we had new cruzeiros as we went through. And our problem as now another technical term, as a closed border country, we had to be able to move products. In order to move copiers into Brazil, we had to take and export things out and import from Brazil. So those interesting things, that the dynamics that come into play are also necessary in connecting the dots. We have to figure out, how do we transfer the currencies? When's the timing? What's the holding costs? How do we do forfeiting and counter trade? And those are some of the areas in your world of finances that are going to be interesting. It's not that we can't overcome it. It's not complicated. It's complex. So, Chris?
Yeah, John, I would agree with everything you said there. And yeah, going back, in a lot of these countries, there's a black market rate that also falls into the dollar because the country itself doesn't export enough. It doesn't get enough dollars in, so it can't release enough dollars to it. I had a customer years ago in Jamaica who, when we placed an order, he would go in for double the amount of hard currency, hoping to get at least that much. And if he got the full amount, then he had a second order to place with me. So yeah, all these things are obstacles, but not big obstacles, not insurmountable, John.
Right. Now, as I turn it to Jennifer, let me say that the other thing that, is not just the dollars, it's the imbalance. I'll call it the imbalance of trade. So, for example, in some countries, it's 2.5 billion and of imports, but 500 million of exports. And Jamaica and Montserrat, $20 million of imports, okay, but exports only $5 million. When we look at how the currency changes and the economies, if we create this single economic environment, those numbers will change. And people, as we trade within each other, the amount of imports and exports in intra-Caribbean is what really the value is in growing our economy. Jennifer, over to you.
Well,
so we're not over to Jennifer, so she's left us. But I'd just like to say that those are the challenges, if you will. And when we put this thing together, that's the economic boom when we take the CARICOM environment of the 15 nations and the people that have associate status. If we work together, working together, we can make a difference.
Well, John, with the world that you and I work, live, and breathe in, between global trade, both the financial sides as well as the physical side of it and the document side, I'm a big believer in global trade will save us.
Yeah. Thank you. Jennifer, back to you.
Connecting the dots with John Fedenin and Chris Principe, looking at financial implications, the capacity of Caribbean ports, so much to chew on and so much to discuss, but we're going to have opportunity to dive a little deeper. Coming up in the spotlight, we'll be showing a clip that demonstrates the scope and potential of the St. Croix megaport infrastructure vis-a-vis the Chanque megaport in Peru. My co-host will be joining me as we address further the possibilities, concerns, and solutions and the implications of the St. Croix megaport. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages.
A key theme in U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's campaign was reducing or eliminating taxes, including no capital gain taxes on cryptocurrencies. In stark contrast, this week a task force led by Barbados, France, and Kenya has proposed global solidarity levies to tax high-polluting sectors, plastics, and cryptocurrencies in order to bridge the climate finance gap and support developing nations. Presented at the UN's COP29 climate talks, these recommendations target industries that heavily pollute but contribute minimally to public revenues, suggesting levies on private jet fuel, frequent fires, fossil fuel windfalls, shipping, plastics, cryptocurrency transactions, stocks and bonds, derivatives, and the ultra-wealthy. The task force estimates that a cryptocurrency tax alone could raise $5.2 billion annually due to the energy-intensive nature of crypto mining, with additional revenue possible from transaction taxes. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, a prominent advocate of climate action, endorsed the proposals, stressing the urgency of finding new revenue sources to fund global climate needs.
This is the Bloomberg Real Estate Report. I'm Denise Pellegrini. A lot of different ways a Trump administration could impact the housing market: inventory, home prices, affordability, mortgage rates, regulations on home building are all in some way connected to the housing market and economic policy more broadly. But one thing that could have a huge impact on the housing market, according to Bess Friedman, CEO at Brown Harris Stevens, is President-elect Donald Trump's talk about removing the limits currently in place on how big of a deduction you can take on your tax returns for the interest you pay on your mortgage.
The one thing that Trump mentioned was that he was going to remove the cap for the SALT deduction, which he actually put in place place in 2017, so that could be a good thing.
The current cap on the SALT, or state and local tax deduction, impacts homeowners most in states like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and California, where home prices and mortgages, and thus mortgage interest paid, are greatest. And that's the Bloomberg Real Estate Report. I'm Denise Pellegrini.
Our deep water port and our economic zone, free trade zone, is less than a mile away from a full 10,000-foot runway airport. And it gives the capability to our manufacturers that are coming here to not only ship from the sea, but by air as well too. I think that's a very important part.
Because of our geographic location and our land acreage, we can build up a lot of containers and containment, so that these products can be shipped into the Caribbean and beyond.
The airport is right next door. You can see the tower, you can see the runway that abuts our facilities.
We will not only repair the park, but we will also modernize the park. We will harden the park. So this will be a state-of-the-art facility.
Welcome back to Connect Caribe Special Report, and we are in the spotlight. And you just saw a clip there, so we are going to look at addressing the critical issues of ownership, inclusivity, economic potential, and strategic foresight framing the St. Croix megaport as a pivotal project for Caribbean trade and development. So I want to thank my co-host for joining me, but John, for the benefit of listeners, because I'm sure they couldn't see obviously what the viewers have been seeing. So before we go to the questions, could you give me and viewers and listeners, what does this project and what we've just seen here, what does that mean? Could you give us a synopsis quick of what we just saw?
Right. Thank you, Jennifer. What we're looking at is the opportunity, as the ambassador and I talked about in the very first segment, that we have the infrastructure that exists as far as the physical infrastructure. The question is, how do we develop all of these things into a comprehensive megaport rather than just the disparate parts? So it requires vision. And we thank the Governor Albert Bryan Jr. for his leadership, really, with the MOU that is the external manifestation of what Wayne Biggs and the Economic Development Agency have done for our territory. And the leadership of Senator Novell Francis in creating the free trade zones and the regulations that do that. Now, we're not done. So we have to create the legislation of looking at it not just from a Virgin Islands perspective and what the opportunity is for us to grow and develop as a port and as an entity, but to take advantage of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, the State Department's actions and what's likely to happen under a new administration, and our ability within our Senate to actually control the rules of what are the customs and duties that go into that. So our economic development benefits really speak to that ability. Also, a not so minor point is that we were mashed up, as we say, during the hurricanes of Irma and Maria in 2017, and there's almost $15 billion of resilience funds that are available in the Virgin Islands, and we're using those funds in mega projects that the governor has designated to fix the airports and the port facilities. So those funds that are available that need matching dollars, and I think as we look at a cooperative venture now, that's where the opportunity is. So it's not just how does the Virgin Islands build a mega port, but who are the constituents, the customers. How do we act in some of the things that we talked about before in the previous segments on how do we work together as a region? How do we pass the laws of a separate customs jurisdiction and allow people to come? So it's the movement of people, and it's the movement of goods, it's the movement of information, and it's the movement of money. So those are the things that I'd offer as we look at this spotlight on St. Croix.
Well, thank you for that overview, John. I know if, in terms of the St. Croix Economic Development Initiative and the CASE project, you've been working on this for quite some time. Then the CARICOM has its vision as well for the integration of Caribbean economic development. So I want to start off with my question about, I wish we could develop in connected voices. We're going to amalgamate the two segments. But the first concern I want to raise here, my question is about ownership and regional benefit. The Shanké Megaport in Peru has raised concerns about ownership and exclusivity of operations. How will the St. Croix Megaport ensure that it remains a Caribbean-led initiative? And what measures do you think are needed to be put in place to guarantee that its operations and benefits are shared equitably across the region? And you mentioned all of these different dollars and so forth. And so, I mean, I'm sure that this question is going to come into play. And I open the floor to everyone to answer, bearing in mind that the time, but what do you think about that, John? And certainly get Dr. Thomas's input there.
Yeah, so I'll start it off and then I'll hand it to my colleagues. But I think the issue has to do with legitimacy and status, okay? So we've started with the MOU with the private sector, but we need to figure out, and that happens with the new Trump administration, how are we able to integrate with CARICOM as a legitimate body? So we have our vision, CARICOM has their economic vision. We need to be able to figure out how can we become a full member of CARICOM and do that. So there are political challenges that we have to overcome. And then when we have status, so like I mentioned in the first one, the private port in Peru is one way of doing that. Okay. And so is this a private sector initiative? Who's going to own the port? And there's different models of port infrastructure in the United States. For example, there's the Virginia model, which says that the tractors and that handle the containers in the port is operated, that it's all owned in the port. Okay. In other ports, in Newport, Port of New York and New Jersey, the tractors and the movement and the longshoremen are owned by the shipping companies. So Kuehne+Nagel, Franz Mass, Crowley, Tropical Shipping would own those transportation vehicles. So if we're going to be a mega port, how do we enable the shipment of goods to be controlled within the port as opposed to the competing interests of movement of assets and materials if the different carriers and countries own those assets? So with that and the political nature of those, I turn to Dr. Thomas, of course.
Before Dr. Thomas jumps in, because I do have a question for him, let's come back in Connected Voices, and I have a couple questions. I definitely have one for Ambassador Thomas. So let's wrap up this segment and come back and round off with the other questions and get everybody else's input. So we'll be right back after these messages.
Reimagine a world where the Caribbean is seamlessly connected, where our people, our cultures, and our economies move freely across the islands. This is Connect Caribbean, more than a ferry service. It's the heartbeat of a new era, an era where economic opportunities expand, where trade flows freely across our seas, and cultural exchange flourishes. We are linking businesses, empowering communities, and reigniting the hope for a truly integrated Caribbean. Together, we're shaping a brighter, more unified future for the Caribbean. Connect Caribbean, connecting our islands, our people, our future.
Welcome back to Connect Caribbean Report. This is a special edition of Connect Caribbean. Well, I know Dr. Thomas had a response, but after you give your response, I do have a question for you, Ambassador Thomas. So, yes, go ahead.
Okay, one of the key things for me is this. He who controls the gold usually controls the rules. And the key thing is this, is ensuring that our access to capital and our capital flows match the values of the project and match the vision of the project. So for me, that's key. So I really believe that this vision about the Caribbean megaport can happen and will happen. I'm definitely going to play my part to make sure that happens in terms of Connect Caribbean. And but what's key is making sure that he who brings the money is aligned with what we want to do. Otherwise, he changes. That's the key thing.
I'd like to segue into to Chris, because I think that the degree of difficulty, Ambassador, comes into where is the money. So, for example, if we look at the Caribbean, we're largely, if we looked at it from a global scale, we're a developing nation. Okay, we're in a developing economy, and we need support. And so the question is, how do we get that support? Will that come from a St. Croix standpoint from the Trump administration? Will that come from the collaborative nature of the countries? How much gold do the countries have in order to do that when we're trying to bolster their economies? Because it's not a grouping of equals. There's different sizes, different people, different processes, and the entrepreneurs that are within these environments need that support. And the major banks have largely abandoned the Caribbean. So with that, I'd like Chris to talk about, if it's the gold rules, Chris Principe, where is the gold in the Caribbean and from other sources?
Yeah, thanks, John. I got it all in my basement. Anyway, it's excellent points. And when you talk about the economies, even if you group them together, it's not a significant block. So internal funding, I think, is going to be very difficult. I think that where we need to look is elsewhere. And one of the dangers is not to compare ourselves to other initiatives. The Peru initiative is really an interesting one, but it's backed all by Chinese money. We have a much uniquer proposition, and we're not likely to get backed by Chinese money, right? So where can we go? There's a lot of space, I think, on the private finance side, particularly when you look at the uniqueness of this project. You can get private finance to finance against your tax credits, for instance, that will come or already come as part of the MOU and part of what the new administration would bring. You can get financing for the contingency fund that John mentioned earlier for the hurricane, because it's guaranteed money, so people will finance it against that. But I think that we need to make a bigger effort into the private community rather than depend on the banks themselves.
Okay, well, I want to get in these two questions before we wrap up, because the time goes by very quickly, and it really has to do with regional economic growth, with the potential to serve as a trade hub. How will the St. Croix megaport position itself to attract international trade routes and increase the competitiveness of the Caribbean exports in the global market? Anyone can take that question.
Okay. Now, I spent about 3 hours yesterday with one of the leading political figures in the region, and we discussed a number of things. And we discussed St. Croix, we discussed the MOU, and the statement by this very influential political leader in the region is that the potential of St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands, and its contribution it can make to the region has never been clearly articulated. So vision has to be cast before vision can be embraced. And I believe vision has to be cast on two sides. And that's really why we're having this program, and that's why what we're doing is so important. So vision has to be cast to the Caribbean, and vision has to be cast to the Trump administration. Now, to the Caribbean, it's awakening their eyes to realize that you can have a conduit of capital, a conduit of trade right at your doorstep. And Connect Caribbean, we're going to make sure that happens. Now, the vision to the Trump administration would be the strategic value of creating conditions for investment in the U.S. Virgin Islands to counter and to safeguard your third border. So the case is being made, but it has to be louder. And those are my thoughts.
Yeah, so Ambassador, I think I would add to your comments that we're looking at a snapshot, but this is really a moving picture, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, for me, I came back to St. Croix after having left in 1952, some 20 years ago, with the vision okay? And I was trying to cast my vision. But internally, the understanding of supply chain and logistics and worldwide trade facilitation wasn't a well-known uh, area that people even understood fully. Okay. And now the rest of the Caribbean, I think it's the same thing. If we look at supply chain integration and the impact on small and medium-sized manufacturers and SMEs, entrepreneurship, small and medium-sized companies, how they work together, getting funded, were all things that have evolved over the 20-year period. So now with the vision of leaders such as Anthony Weeks, our own, with the St. Croix development initiative and the case for the Caribbean economy, it's coming into place. We have a governor that understands it. We have a legislature that understands it. We have an economy that needs it. And so that snapshot of where we are today, looked at in context of where we've been and where we need to go, I think that's where we can compel the people that you're meeting with and the government people, the Trump administration, to say, this is back to the original reason why the Virgin Islands was purchased by Denmark in the Treaty of 1916, to prevent the incursion of the Germans and to protect America's third border. So if we look at that context and what the opportunity could be for all of the Caribbean people that are also in the United States right now, then the numbers change and the opportunity.
Well,
thank you, gentlemen. I mean, so much to unpack there in terms of the potential, the unique needs of the Caribbean and prioritizing the Caribbean and maximizing connectivity, transport networks, and certainly Chris Principe's contribution there with the financial implications. This is a lot to discuss, and I'm sure that we can do a part 2 at some point and come back and discuss how the St. Croix Megaport is developing legislation and all those things that need to come together in this ecosystem to make this work. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have here on Connect Caribbean Report. It's a special report looking at St. Croix Megaport initiative, certainly backed by the Caribbean American Single Economy and CD, and also looking to integrate that with the CARICOM vision. So certainly we can come back and have more conversation, and hopefully we can get a representative from CARICOM, private sector organization, to speak a little bit more about the CARICOM's perspective. But that's all the time we have, and certainly I want to thank our co-host, Ambassador Dr. Andre Thomas, is the chairman and CEO of Connect Caribbean Group, and Chris Principe, he is the publisher of Financial IT, and John Clendenin, he is the chairman, president, and CEO of IC Group. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for being here and spending this hour with us. And we'll be right back here next week, same time, 1:30 EST or AST, whichever one makes sense to you. But it was great being here with you, and we'll see you next week, Wednesday. Bye.
Welcome to our TV network, your ultimate destination for all things exciting and essential. From mouth-watering food to the latest in fashion, health, education, music, movies, and news, plus thrilling sports and breathtaking travel, our TV network brings it all to you. Tune in today and experience the best of every world, all in one place, rtv.network.